This was one of those ideas that a few people were campaigning for in the comments, and once I actually sat down and thought about it, I was like, these universes are gonna gel together really nicely. I mean, a few of the character fusions I make not based on the powers of the characters, but based on their roles on the individual shows. But then there are some fusions that were just so obvious and seamless, like pairing together the two flamey boys with eye scars and daddy issues. It just made perfect sense. Anyway, I really dig the story in this one, and I hope you all enjoy it as well. Here goes my bending academia. Hit like if you want, subscribe if you feel like, but either way, enjoy the show. The world is a divided place, and growing more so each day. See, hundreds of years ago, people from different regions began developing the ability to bend the elements to their whim. Soon, the world was divided not by countries, but by bending regions: water, earth, fire, and air. Over time, it got to a point where 80% of people were being born with a bending ability. Some would use their powers for good, and others for evil. As villains started going into other bending regions and wreaking havoc, people would grow weary of others with different powers from their own. More and more people were growing skeptical of other benders. And things would only get worse when people would begin to develop additional abilities. As bending abilities evolved, some younger generations of benders were being born with additional quirks to their powers, such as firebenders gaining the ability to shoot lightning, or waterbenders being born with amphibious body parts. More and more people started growing skeptical of those different from them, and the world was headed to a dark place. Until a hero arose to unify the regions. A bender capable of bending all 4 elements began fighting villains in every region, traveling from one bending nation to the next, keeping the peace. Everyone loved and trusted this hero, who they'd refer to as the All-Bender. He'd eventually establish a prestigious school called the Universal Bending Academy, or UBA, where benders of all creeds could come to train to be heroes that would help protect all the regions of the world. The All-Bender also ensured each region would get heroes from each other type of bending, so people could see proudly on display benders from other regions help protecting their own kind. A tenuous peace was kept through the first All-Bender's life, and as he reached his final years, he'd pass on his powers so this peace could continue. He had the unique ability to grant the all-bending ability to someone worthy of being the world's next great hero. This continued through 8 generations as the power was passed on and the All-Bender remained a symbol of peace and hope. But the 8th All-Bender had a harder time than his predecessors. As more and more people had developed enhanced versions of bending abilities, villains became stronger and stronger. Toshinori Roku, the 8th All-Bender, had nearly lost his life, fighting a horrifying villain named Amon Shigaraki, a powerful bender with the power to take people's bending abilities. At the end of their battle, Toshinori was left too weak to continue fighting as the All-Bender. He'd have to pass on his powers prematurely. And as he was weakened and spending time at UBA trying to choose a successor, the most revered hero of the Fire region, Ozai Todoroki, would push his own vile agenda forth. He spread propaganda to his people that they should ban other bending heroes from their lands, that firebenders were superior to all and only they should be allowed to protect their own. It was a hateful and cruel endeavor, to be sure. Toshinori had to choose a successor soon, but it wasn't a process he could rush. This was the most important decision he'd ever make. Then, after 2 years of trying to choose, he'd finally find who he believed to be the right person. Unfortunately, nobody else would think young Aang Midoriya was the right choice. Aang Midoriya had been one of few people born without any bending ability whatsoever. His parents were airbenders, but they were raising him in the fire region. It was hard enough for airbenders in that region as people were growing more and more hateful of those not like them, but being born with no abilities at all just made it that much worse. Cruel firebenders at school would taunt Aang for being a sign that the airbenders were a weaker race and were dying off, while firebenders grew more and more powerful with each generation. But Aang had a hero's heart. He wanted peace between all creeds more than anything. Even growing up being relentlessly bullied by firebenders, he still believed there was good in everyone, and nobody was superior because of their place or circumstances of birth. This would shine through him in even the darkest times, and through a series of happy coincidences, the Allbender himself would get to see Aang's heart on display. One day he was out trying to save a firebender from his school from a villain, despite the fact that Aang had no abilities whatsoever. He'd also find out that that boy that Aang was trying to save was someone who consistently bullied Aang. After that, Toshinori would spend months in secret training Aang so he could be physically ready to take on the powers of the Allbender. Toshinori Roku thought that Aang's heart was all he needed to be one of the best Allbenders the world had seen. And when he would finally pass on the power and announce his decision to the world, that he'd given his powers to a boy with no prior bending ability, it would cause some major uproar. Never before had the power of the Allbender been passed on to someone with no prior bending skills. It meant he hadn't grown up practicing with a power and would have to be starting fresh with no experience at all. Toshinori assured everyone that Aang was the right choice and that he'd watch over his training at UBA, but it didn't ease many minds. And Ozai Todoroki would use this as fuel to show the firebenders that the Allbender being the hero of the world was a dying idea. He ventured further to say that his own son, who'd also just enrolled at UBA, was truly set to be the next hero of the world. Zuko Todoroki was an incredibly skilled firebender, but was also the very first person, aside from the Allbender himself, to be able to bend two elements, fire and water. It was one of the rarest quirks the world had ever seen. Ozai claimed this was a sign that the Allbender truly wasn't special, and bolstered his son up as the new savior of the Fire Nation and prime hero of the world. He claimed his son would prove through his time at UBA that he was superior to this new, inexperienced Allbender. Of course, his son wasn't totally thrilled by the spotlight being shone on him, but regardless, the whole world was poised to watch his rivalry with the Allbender. All this pressure was terrifying to Aang. He was worried that the world may be right, that he was the wrong choice. How could he keep peace between nations that didn't believe in him? Going into UBA with no experience in bending, he'd need to work harder than any student before to become the hero the world needed him to be. Luckily, he'd make some friends who'd encourage him and help him along the way. Katara Uraraka was a waterbender who'd been training her whole life to go to UBA, and finally, her dream was coming true. Of course, she hadn't expected her brother to be coming along with her. Sokka hadn't been born a bender, but because UBA was so far from home, Katara's parents didn't want her moving there alone. Sokka moved with her and went to a regular high school nearby, so the two could stay together. But Sokka would end up spending a lot of time on UBA grounds with his sister, as the apartment they shared was cramped and pretty unpleasant. Their family had never had much money, but Katara was determined to become a great hero with good pay so she could afford to give her whole family a better life. Once classes started, like everyone else, Katara would be intently watching how the new Allbender in training would be doing on his first days of class. And it wasn't great. He was clearly trying hard, but everyone around him had significantly more bending experience. He was doing an alright job picking up airbending, as he'd grown up seeing his mom do it, but all the other abilities weren't coming to him quickly. Many students, especially the firebenders, were looking to prove themselves against Aang, and spent all their time trying to show him up and picking on him. Surprisingly, Zuko Todoroki said nothing to Aang. Ever, really. But it was very clear that Zuko was a superior bender to everyone in his class. The whole world was impatiently waiting for the school's first major event at midterms, the Bending Festival. It was a multi-event televised showcase of the abilities being honed by UBA students, and the biggest part of it was the bending battle, where classmates would fight to show who was the best bender to that point. Everyone wanted to see if the new All-Bender could indeed hold his own against the son of Ozai. If Aang lost, it would just go to prove to the Firebenders the cruel message that Ozai was spreading, that Firebenders were the superior race. Katara despised Ozai Todoroki and knew as well as any that Aang needed to beat his son in the festival, so she took it upon herself to help him train in their off hours. She made quick friends with Aang, and after school he'd come back to her place for her to teach him all she knew about waterbending. Over the next months, Aang's schooling paired with Katara's teachings would make him very adept at waterbending and airbending, but he was still struggling with the other two. And even with the training, he wasn't better at his bending than Zuko. If he was going to have any chance at beating him in the festival, he'd need to be at least decent at 3 forms of bending. Luckily, Sokka had met someone who could help him with that. Toph Kirishima was an incredibly skilled earthbender, despite what many considered a significant hindrance. She was blind. Despite that, she'd always wanted to go to UBA more than anything, but her parents hadn't always been sure about it. She overheard them one night discussing the idea of not letting her go, and she was crushed. Both because she hated hearing her parents say they didn't believe she could do it, but also because she'd always been scared that deep down she wasn't brave enough to be a hero. She had to prove to herself that she was, and if her parents weren't going to let her go, she wouldn't give them a say in the matter. She ran away and moved to the city where UBA was, and made her money fighting in underground sport bending, taking on stronger and stronger foes to try and prove to herself that she was hero-worthy. And she was crushing it. People underestimated her because of her lack of vision, plus, along with her fantastic bending abilities, she also had the added power to harden parts of her body like the earth she bent, making it very difficult for her opponents to injure her. Sokka had become friends with her in his time exploring the city and introduced her to Aang and Katara. She was much more brash and hot-headed than Katara, but she was willing to teach Aang all the same. Through her time working with Aang and Katara, they all learned a lot about each other. While Aang was meant to have all his attention on his training, he started to realize that Toph also needed help. Not with her fighting, but with her parents. She'd fled home without even making a case to her parents about why she should be allowed to attend UBA, and clearly it was the right path for her. And any problems with bravery she may have, she could get through at school. The point of going was to become better and to prepare her for the world of heroing. But before she could go, she had to reconcile with her parents and show them that this was definitively the right path for her. Aang told her he'd go with her to talk to her parents, but Katara was hesitant. A trip to and from Toph's home would take days off of Aang's training that they couldn't afford. But Aang insisted. He said that if he couldn't be trusted to help his friends, then how could anyone trust him to help the world? The whole group would go and be there for Toph, as she and her family would have a much-needed heart-to-heart. Her parents would see just how much she was helping the All-Bender and get a demonstration of just how skilled of a bender she was herself, even without schooling. They'd agree to let her go the following school year. The trip was a success, but it had meant 2 extra days gone from training. And meanwhile, with the bending festival just days away, Zuko Todoroki was using every second he had to become the ultimate bender. Now, Zuko Todoroki was an angry boy, not as outwardly so as some others, but there had been a mountain of pressure on the boy's shoulders since he was young, and it weighed on him every day. And in a few days, he'd be on stage for the whole world, knowing his father and the entire Fire region were looking to him to prove that they were the greatest bending region. And while he wanted nothing more than to make his people proud, he'd never been totally sure about his father's ideals for the world. Zuko didn't think he was better than others because of the powers he was born with. He believed his worth came from his hard work and determination to become better. But he did still want to prove that his determination and training outweighed Aang's. Toph, Katara, Sokka, and Aang returned from their trip and put in their last days of preparation, going all out and hoping that it was enough to defeat the prodigal firebender. Zuko Todoroki's uncertainty about his father's morals had once led him to openly question Ozai, a mistake he'd never made a second time. The so-called hero scorched his son's face, leaving a scar over his left eye as a reminder of what happens when you disrespect your superiors. He still questioned his father, but never outwardly. And regardless of his feelings about his father's plans, he did want to show his strength to everyone. He wanted to defeat the Allbender, and his chance had finally arrived. The tournament was exactly as exciting as the world had hoped. Everyone watched with bated breath as both Zuko and Aang fought through the tiers, showing incredible progress in their training. Aang had become skilled at air, water, and earth bending, and knew just enough fire bending to use it when he needed to. But he did take a lot of hits on his rise through the festival, whereas his pending opponent had barely been scratched. Zuko had torn through his classmates. He'd achieved the ability to alter the temperature of the water he bent, so he could freeze it and use incredible ice projectile attacks. Nobody had been prepared to defend against that, and that paired with his firebending meant that none others were a match for him. Finally, the time came for Aang and Zuko to face off in the finals. A whole day had been dedicated to the fight. The world waited anxiously, and Aang didn't feel ready. But he knew he had to win. A few hours before the fight, Aang found Todoroki, who had nothing to say to the Allbender, but Aang simply wanted to let him know how impressed he was. Zuko was an incredible fighter, and Aang had always been in awe of how hard he worked. But he also said, while he respected Zuko, he couldn't let him win. If Aang failed, Zuko's father could use that as the final sign to the rest of the firebenders that they truly were superior, and it could end the years of tenuous peace the Allbenders had helped maintain for so long. Zuko said nothing in response, and simply walked away. The next time they saw each other was in the arena. For miles, you could hear the cheers of the crowd as the fight began. Aang was on the defense in the early rounds. He was using his earthbending to shield himself, then working in a few airborne attacks, trying to use speed and mobility to his advantage. But Todoroki was fast too. He used his ice to make the ground slick, throwing Aang off balance many times, then predominantly used fire attacks, since it was Aang's biggest shortfall. For every hit Aang was getting in, Zuko was getting 5. It was coming down to the end and both boys were worn out, but Zuko was clearly faring far better. This got the firebenders in the crowd into a riot. They shot flames into the air and cheered Zuko's name. It was what he thought he wanted. But looking at every non-firebender in the crowd, he saw fear. They all knew exactly what Aang had said to be true. For peace to be kept, Aang needed to win this. The final round began and Aang gave everything he had. He bent air, earth, and water simultaneously, doing everything he could to knock his opponent from the ring, which was his only hope to win at this point. Zuko was faring just as well as he had the rest of the fight, so Aang, in an attempt at a final blow, hurled a sphere of earth, wind, and water careening across the field, followed by a single burst of fire that he hoped Zuko wouldn't see coming. From the crowd's point of view, watching from afar, it seemed to work. Only Aang and Zuko knew what really happened. Zuko had blocked the first blow and had seen the next in time. He could have dodged it or possibly even taken the hit unharmed. But he flashed a knowing look to Aang, and in a fraction of a second, the fight was over. Unbeknownst to the crowd, Zuko had purposely taken the hit and was knocked from the arena. Aang had won. Ozai was outraged, the Fire Nation was ashamed, but at least for now, peace was still possible between the regions. And Zuko was determined to help Aang keep it that way. After the fight, Zuko agreed to train Aang in firebending. Their friendship would infuriate Ozai, and he'd publicly disown his son. Ozai still had a frightening influence over the Firebenders, but hopefully the budding friendship between Zuko and Aang would help show the world that peace was possible and could be maintained for all of Aang's time as the Allbender. I think this is one of my favorite stories I've done on the channel in a little while. I mean, my favorite overall episode recently is still the Disney princesses as Marvel and DC villains. I really like how that one turned out as a whole. But this story was really fun to write, and I think I had a decent balance of the two universes. I hope you all agree. Anyway, if you're new to the channel, I've got lots of other My Hero Academia episodes and a few other Avatar: The Last Airbender episodes. I've turned My Hero Academia characters into dragons, I've venomized them, I've made them Iron Man suits, I've given heroes other than Deku one for all, I did a genre swap with Avatar characters. I'm gonna stop listing things now, maybe I'll show more on screen, I don't know. And if you like my superhero art, I've got an ink bundle full of a bunch of my superhero drawings that you can buy and download and color them. You can find that in the little bar underneath this video. But anyway, everybody, that's all for today. I'm Christian Pearson. This has been PopCross Studios, home of the nerdiest art videos on YouTube. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video on Monday.